Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to create some interference birthday cards using this Nested Birthday Celebrations die set, as well as the Mini Drop Shadow Sentiments Volume 1. And I'm specifically using that happy birthday there because it goes with the theme. I'm also going to bring in some Best Wishes frames dies, as well as the Nested Labels Twisted Rectangles die sets. These are all from Lisa Horton Crafts, and it's no secret how much I love interference inks. I will be using a bunch of the Cloud9, or several of the Cloud9 interference inks with these as well. The first thing I want to do though is I have a lot of die cutting that I've already done off screen. For this Nested Birthday Celebrations die, I want to use some Gina Masking Magic, and I want to use it to be able to ink my balloons in different colors and have a little bit of control of that there. And the Masking Magic is basically like a big Post-it note. It has temporary adhesive on it, so you can die cut it super easily. You can place it where you want to resist ink or just to keep clean from ink. So I have taken the center two dies from this die set and I've used it to die cut the Masking Magic. Sorry, my camera gets shaky every now and then. I'm filming these things when I have family home for Christmas holidays. We live in an old house with not very good joists in the floors. So whenever someone is walking upstairs above my crafting area, the camera starts to shake. I try not to do it when there's too much movement in the house, but sometimes you just can't help it. So first thing I'm doing is using some detail scissors to trim around the outside frame of this die set. Then I'm going to put that on the outside frame. I want to keep that frame nice and clean from the inks, and this is going to keep it that way. It's much easier to use this than to say use like printer paper and then temporary adhesive. Because this has the adhesive all over it, it is super easy to use. And I'll regularly use these things and then keep those die cuts or whatever I've created as masks to reuse several times, because they can be reused several times. The ink, even though it will kind of stain the top part of the Masking Magic, it is still protecting the cardstock underneath. That ink is only going on the Masking Magic. Now, if you've never seen any of my videos using the interference inks are inks that have a property to them that gives it a different look on light cardstock than it does on dark cardstock. And one of the ways that I like to play with that is using either black soot interference ink or hickory smoke interference to do a little bit of shading in order to be able to show off both properties of that ink. So here I've used the hickory smoke. I don't want my shading to be too dramatic, and I find that the hickory smoke is a little bit more subtle than using the black soot. So I'm used that on the outside of the balloons, and now I'm using those detailed scissors to cut out around the outside edges of the balloons. A lot of them are not going to be absolutely perfect. There's a little bit of guesswork as to where the edges of the balloons would go. So I'm just trying to make it look as nice as possible. And I'm doing one for each one of these balloons. The only thing I'm not keeping from this frame is the strings for the balloons. I'm going to use a marker to color those once I'm done here. So I'm going to take those little masking pieces here. I'm going to put them on top of my die cut on each one of those balloons that I want to protect from the ink. And I'm working on a Lisa Horton Tacky Mat here. It's going to hold that die cut in place and make sure that it's not going to move on me while I'm doing my ink blending. So I have 3 different colors of interference inks that I'm going to be using. So I'm going to do 2 balloons of each color. So I'm masking most of my balloons, keeping 2 of them without masking on them. And then I'm using that ink blending brush with the Hickory Smoke Distress ink to ink around it just to give it a little bit of shading. You don't necessarily have to do this step. You could just ink blend each one of the colors and just have it basically show the die part of the ink pad, but I think it looks so much more interesting by adding that shading. So the first color there I used was Sapphire Gold, and this one looks blue on white cardstock, and then on my Hickory Smoke Distress ink, when you tilt it into the light, you're going to see more of the gold part of this ink pad. Then I'm going to change which balloons I have masked. So I will put my mask on top of those ones that I have just inked. It's definitely better to wait a few minutes and let that ink completely absorb into the paper and let it dry before doing the next step. You'll see as I'm working, especially the last balloons that I'm doing, that the masks don't really want to stick to those pieces of cardstock, and that's because I haven't waited. I had very little time to be doing this, so I was trying to get this done, and I didn't wait for the ink to completely dry before moving to the next one. The second color that I used there was Lavender Fields. So that one is going to look purple on the light cardstock, and it's going to have a green interference. So when you tilt it to the light, it's going to have a little bit of a green shimmer to it. For my last balloons, I'm using Tropical Paradise, and this one is going to look pink, but it's going to have a blue interference to it. So it's going to look more blue when you tilt it into light and you see that shimmer. And you still see the shimmer on the light parts of the cardstock as well, but it's just more heavy on the dark parts. And for some of the cards that I'm doing here, I am going to be using gray cardstock and black cardstock so that you can see the different colors on them. And it's fun to play with the different shades and the different colors in order to just get different looks out of those interference inks. They're very versatile, and you can use colored cardstocks as well. I tend to use white, black, or a little bit of gray because they have the most dramatic finish to them, but you can use colored cardstocks on them as well. Just keep in mind that the ink part, the dye part of the ink is transparent, so it's going to interact with the color, or it's going to show off the color of the cardstock. I used a black Tombow marker there to color my strings for my balloons black, and now this piece is ready to go. I have the outside oval pieces for this die set. I'm just going to ink blend the Tropical Paradise ink, interference ink on top of that. So you can see, because I have black cardstock here, even though you can see pink on my Tacky Mat, when I lift that piece up, you're seeing the bluey purpley color, which is the interference color. The dye part of it, because dye is transparent, just absorbs into the cardstock. You don't see that color. You'll see a little hint of it while you're doing your inking because nothing is absorbed quite yet. But as it dries, that interference kind of raises to the surface, the dye gets absorbed into the paper, and you see the color that is meant to be seen on the dark cardstock. For this card, I have a mat here that I have trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches, and it's just done out of black cardstock. And then I have my white piece from my die cut. This is just the outer die for this nested birthday celebrations die set. And I have that on top of the black, just giving a nice contrast. Then we have our ink blended ovals piece, and this die set has several different dies that nest and layer together so you can have fun creating different looks with them. I'm using it with the birthday balloons part of the die set that goes with it, but you could use it with other images as well. Next, we're putting in that balloon piece, and that's when I realized I had white cardstock on white cardstock, and while it was okay, I wanted there to be a little bit more contrast. So I ended up taking that black Tombow marker and coloring that outside edge of the die cut that I have for the center. It worked perfectly because I had a lot of control over where that marker went. Another option would have been to die cut this a second time with black cardstock and then trim those balloons from the center so that I just created a black frame and then glued that on top of here. It would create a little bit of extra dimension as well. So it just really depends on the type of look that you're going for. For what I wanted, this worked absolutely perfectly. The other thing about trimming, say, a black piece of cardstock to create a frame is sometimes it's a little bit harder to trim something from the inside to get it nice and perfect looking. So by using that marker, I could control exactly where I was coloring. Then I have my sentiment that just says celebrate. It's from this same die set, and I ink blended it with those same sapphire, or with the sapphire gold colors, and just layered those two layers together and put that on the top of the card. I always love when I'm doing balloons to use some glossy accents just to add some shiny glossy dimension on top of that. So I used my glossy accents. I like to put it on kind of like icing a cookie. So I will be careful and put my glossy accents all around the outside edges of whatever I'm covering. And then I will go in and flood that area. It does level out on its own. So you don't have to be absolutely perfect with it. As long as you get it for most of the surface, it works perfectly. You could also use like a die pick or a toothpick to help spread it out if you wanted a thinner layer. I tend to use the tip part of my bottle here. The bottle that I'm using, it's a plastic bottle with a metal needle nose tip on it. I got it from Amazon and I use it with alcohol inks regularly, but I just put my glossy accents in there and just recycled one of the labels from a small glossy accents bottle so that I have that label on top of there. But it works perfectly for this because it has a really nice fine tip to it. The metal or the plastic tip that comes on a glossy accents bottle is also fine. It's just not quite as fine as this. And by putting that in this bottle, I can get really tiny dots of it if I want to. If there's any area that happens to have an air bubble, you want to use a pin to pop it because it's easy to pop when this is in liquid form. If it dries with that bubble in it, it'll be there forever. Another thing is when it levels itself out, if there's a divot anywhere because it hasn't completely covered it because there wasn't enough glossy accents, you definitely want to fill that in while it's still wet to make sure that it is completely covered. And after it is dried mostly, this is the finished product. So when you put the glossy accents on first, it has like a white milky color to it, and then it dries completely clear. So once that card is done, we're ready to start using that happy birthday from the Mini Drop Shadow Sentiments Volume 1 stencil set. So I'm just using some white Hammermill cardstock here. These stencils are smaller, so my cardstock is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, and you can see that the stencil doesn't fit all the way around. I'm still using my Tacky Mat to hold onto the paper, but I just grabbed a piece of painter's tape just to tape that piece down. I only put the painter's tape on the bottom. Any of the times when I want to have it nice and secure, I will hold it. It's just to kind of make sure that that doesn't shift too much on me. If you need to, you could also put a piece of tape on the top to make it a little bit more secure. So for the first color there, I just used some black soot distress ink. I wanted to use one pad for both parts of the stencil, and by using that distress ink first, I could make sure to see the interference properties of this ink, so it's going to have more of a gold look to it. You can still see the black, you can see that it's nice and dark, so it doesn't make it so it's bright gold, but when you tilt it into the light, you see a lot more of that gold color. Then I'm using that same sapphire gold, and I'll do the happy birthday letters for it. I'm just not using the black soot ink down on it first. Now, when I did use that black soot ink, I went with a microfiber cloth and I cleaned the stencil off before going in with that interference pad, just to make sure not to contaminate my pad. I wanted to have that ink over top of the black. I didn't want to mix it in and happen to get it into my pad. You can see how easily those stencils are to line up with each other. And then I'm taking the Best Wishes frame set. I'm going to die cut that happy birthday out of it. I did use some Best Ever Craft tape on there just to make sure that that die wasn't going to shift on me while putting it through my Platinum 6 machine. And you can see that there's also some really beautiful stitching detail on the outside edges of those dies. And I love how just the subtle detail that it has, but it just gives it such a nice finished look. I'm using that same sapphire gold interference pad to do some of the details for the rest of my card, and I'm doing it on top of black cardstock. So we're going to see more of that gold color. Again, that blue is going to absorb into the cardstock. You're not going to see it. You're going to see more of that gold finish. And by using these inks over top of cardstock for my mats and for my frames, I know that it's going to blend and coordinate perfectly with my stenciled image because it's the same ink that I've used for that. It's much easier, in my opinion, to use the inks to create mats that coordinate perfectly and have that extra little bit of shimmer to it than it would be to try find a plain cardstock that's already made that would coordinate with it. And it just has such a unique and beautiful look to it that it's such an easy way to coordinate everything that I do it really quite often, but I love the fact that you can create such a unique look with it because of that. So I'm cleaning off any excess ink from my stencils as well as from my work surface while my ink blended mats and frames, they're dry. I have a card base here that's 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches. I'm putting my mat on there, and that is cut to 4 inches by 5 1/4. And then I have the solid large piece here that is cut out of white cardstock to glue on top of that black. When I did the ink blending for the black, I wanted to make sure that there was no piece of that black cardstock visible. So I did make sure when I was doing that ink blending to make sure it went in enough so that it was hidden behind that cardstock die cut. Now I didn't need to do the entire piece of cardstock because most of it is covered by that die cut, but I wanted to make sure that most of it was there. And then finally, I glued in the happy birthday stenciled die cut piece in the center of the card there. And here I do have white on white cardstock, but for the look I was going here, I didn't mind it as much because it also has that stitching detail on there. So it adds that extra little bit of detail as well as some dimension. So for my third card here, it's going to be very similar to the second card, but I'm going to share a different way or another way to add a little bit of extra dimension. So for the first layer, which is the shadow for the happy birthday, I'm using that same black distress pad, ink blending those colors in there, and then using that microfiber cloth to take off the excess of the ink. If there's a little bit left there, that's totally fine. I just don't want as much of the ink that gets on that stencil as possible. Then I'm using the Tropical Paradise pad to ink over top of this. Now, when I'm ink blending with these interference pads, some of them are drier than others. This one happened to be very, very juicy. So when I take this stencil off here, there's a little bit of ink seepage or leakage underneath that stencil. That can be prevented by being a little bit more light-handed with the stencil and making sure to do light layers and let them dry in between. Like I said before, I was kind of in a hurry to finish these cards, so I didn't end up correcting myself or redoing this. There's enough going on with the card that it's not the main focus, but there is a way to prevent that, and that's just being light-handed with that ink until you're more familiar with how much ink is on your ink blending brush. Now to add that extra bit of dimension as well as sparkle, I'm using Moon Dust Stickles Glitter Gel. Put it in the upper layer of the stencil, which has the letters on it, and then I set that aside to completely dry. To add a little bit of extra detail to this card, I'm using the balloons from the Nested Birthday Celebrations die set, mainly that center balloon because it's the kind of full balloon. So I have that die cut 3 times, and I'm just using those detail scissors to trim away the excess and kind of create a complete balloon here. I'm going to create 3 balloons with the same 3 colors that I used in that first card. So I'll be using Tropical Paradise, Lavender Fields, and Sapphire Gold. So I need 3 balloons die cut, which is why I die cut that background 3 times. I'm using cardstock scraps though, so you can see that I don't have complete die cuts here. It's not necessary because I only wanted that center balloon anyways. So by using the detail scissors, I have a lot of control, making sure to get any of that excess of that die cut off of there. And you can do little slivers off of there, perfecting the shape of the balloons as well. Once I have that done, I have put them on my tacky mat. That's just going to hold them in place while I'm doing my inking and making sure that I have them the color that I want them to be. I'll use that same black Tombow marker that I used before to make the strings of the balloons black. I could have also used the ink blending brush as well as the black distress ink that I'm using here to do the shading around the outside. But by using that marker, I just have a little bit more control. I don't have to worry about not getting the ink where I don't want it. Once I have that black down, I can use a damp microfiber cloth to clean off my tacky mat and make sure to get the excess of that off there. And then I have some other die cuts with both white and black cardstock that I want for my mats. And I'm going to do the same thing that I did for the last card that I really do for most cards when I'm using the interference inks. And I'm going to use those same pads to do my to ink blend my mats. And you can see that I'm using this exact same pad and how different it looks on that white die cut than it looks on that black die cut. That's the beauty of these pads. They're like, I swear they're like magic in a pad. I don't think I'll ever tire of using them because they just have such a fun wow factor to them. For the next balloon, I'm using that Sapphire Gold. That first one was that Tropical Paradise, and then the third one here I'm using the Lavender Fields. And when I did the ink blending for that, I went right down the string of the balloon, and I wasn't really worried about making sure that that string of the balloon stayed black. If you wanted it to, you could just use a piece of tape or something like the Best Ever Craft tape just to put a mat on top of it to resist that ink or to cover it, protect it from that ink. But these strings are not the focal point of this design, so I don't think it's going to make any difference to have that ink on there. Then I am ready to put my card together. So once again, I have a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch card base here, and I'm just using Best Ever or Barely Art glue to glue down each one of those mats, putting an acrylic block on it between different layers, and that's just going to hold everything flat, keep my hands free to work on other things or put glue on other things. I just find that it's very helpful to have that there. Then I can put the happy birthday die cut piece on there and finally finish it off with some balloons. Now, when I first was thinking about these balloons in my head I had the sentiment, the happy birthday sentiment smaller, so there was more room on top of it, and I was just going to do a cluster of balloons. But when I started to put them down, I realized there wasn't that much space on the top there, and I thought it would look a little bit odd having a cluster just towards the top left corner. So I just put it down the left side. Another option would be to do 3 more balloons and put some down the right side as well. I think that would balance it all out really well. I still like the way that this is, but you could easily add 3 more balloons or take one of the balloons and put that on the left-hand side if you wanted some there as well. To add even more texture, as if that Stickles glitter gel on those words wasn't enough, I put more of the glossy accents around the balloons. Like I said before, when I'm doing balloons, I just love making them look like they are shiny and round, and the glossy accents does that, and it does it perfectly. So I have that around there, and I'm going to let that completely dry, and you can see how it goes a little bit more clear from that milky consistency when you first put it on. Here is the finished card, and I love it. Like, it's a really simple card. There's not a whole lot of complication to it, but the magic is in those interference inks and the shimmer and beauty that they have. Then we have our second one, and this would be a great masculine happy birthday card. You don't have a lot of things on there that are a little bit more feminine. It's just very simple and to the point. And then our very first nested birthday celebration cards. Each one of these has interference inks on them, but you can see that they look different from each other, but they have that gorgeous shimmer to them. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.